Hey guys, tonight we slip into the drafty doorway of a medieval cottage, the kind with a thatched roof that looks as though one strong wind could whisk it away into the next county. The fire is sputtering weakly in the corner, smoke curling out with more determination than warmth, and you can already smell something bubbling in the pot. The scent is a strange one, equal parts earthy, sour, and a little singed. You'd like to think it's stew, but it could just as easily be laundry water someone forgot about. You're about to sit down for dinner in the Middle Ages, and let's be honest, you probably won't survive this meal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're joining me tonight, I'd love for you to drop a comment with your location and the local time. I always find it fascinating to see where everyone's listening in from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the darkness. Even though it's dinner time, the room feels dim, lit only by the flicker of the hearth. Candles are expensive, so unless you're lucky enough to have tallow to burn, the only glow comes from firewood that is damp more often than not. You're squinting to see what's being served, but honestly, that may be for the best. Because here's the truth. Medieval kitchens are less about food delight and more about food survival. If you manage to leave the table full and without something crawling in your bowl, that's a win. You glance at the long wooden table, a slab of rough-hewn planks that wobbles ever so slightly when anyone leans on it. There are no matching plates, no cutlery neatly arranged. Instead, there are wooden bowls, some with chips taken out, some with cracks sealed by pitch, all passed down through years of use. You run a hand over one and feel how greasy it is, the sheen of meals long since eaten soaked into the wood. Washing dishes thoroughly is exactly a habit, yet water is precious, and soap even more so. So there's a certain patina of history clinging to everything. In the center of the table sits a loaf of bread, though loaf may be too generous a word. It's hard, flat, and suspiciously gray. Someone has hacked at it with a knife, but the knife is dull, so the bread looks more torn than sliced. You hesitate before picking it up, mostly because it might double as a weapon in a pinch. A scholarly debate still lingers on whether the poorest classes routinely mixed things like ground beans or even powdered tree bark into bread flour, just to stretch it further. Historians can't agree if this was common practice or more of a famine desperation trick. But either way, you don't feel reassured. Bread should not crunch in unexpected ways. Across the room, a woman stirs a cauldron with a wooden paddle as tall as her arm. She doesn't measure anything, not because she's careless, but because measuring spoons aren't really a thing. Cooking is instinctive here, handfuls, pinches, guesses. What's in the pot? Probably pottage, the medieval equivalent of a one-pot wonder. Pottage is a perpetual stew. Cabbage, turnips, maybe some barley, boiled together day after day, with new scraps added in as available. If you're lucky, you might spot a shred of meat floating in there. If you're less lucky, It could be last week's cabbage making its final stand. The smell confirms it, tangy and vegetal, with a faint, smoky undertone. The texture is somewhere between chunky soup and wallpaper paste, and when the spoon dips in, you hear that slow, gloppy plop. Everyone leans forward, bowls at the ready, because this is dinner, and you don't complain. Not out loud, anyway. Someone hands you a chunk of that hard bread and gestures for you to dip it straight into the pot. This is your trencher, your edible plate. In wealthier homes, trenchers were thick slices of stale bread used to soak up juices. But here in this cottage, the bread doubles as food and utensil. You dunk it in and watch as the crust softens, just enough that you can finally tear off a bite without risking your teeth. It tastes of smoke and sourness, not entirely pleasant, but filling enough to quiet the rumble in your stomach. As you chew, you notice how people eat. There's no orderly sequence, no waiting politely for everyone to be served. Meals are communal and a little chaotic. A pot is shared, hands dip in, spoons scrape, and children dart around with bowls that look far too big for their hands. Dogs lurk beneath the table, quick to snatch any crumb that drops. The noise is a steady hum, slurping, chewing, the occasional laugh. And then, suddenly, someone coughs into the pot. Nobody reacts. This is normal. Hygiene is flexible in these parts. You make a mental note to scoop from the edge next time. As you sip the lukewarm ale that passes for a drink, you can't help but think about water. You're thirsty, but you've already been warned. Don't drink straight from the well unless you fancy a bout of dysentery. People didn't necessarily know the science behind germs, but they knew water could make you sick. So ale is safer. It's weak, more like liquid bread than beer, but at least it won't kill you. Probably. The evening wears on, and you notice just how little variety there is. Night after night, it's some version of this. Bread, pottage, maybe cheese, if you're fortunate. This repetition shapes medieval life. Historians still argue whether the monotony was worse among peasants, or if even the wealthy tired of endless feasts of roast meat and rich sauces. Either way, you're beginning to crave something, anything, that doesn't taste of boiled cabbage. As you sit back, you glance at the rafters above. Herbs dangle from beams, drying in the smoke. Sage, thyme, maybe a sprig of rosemary. They look promising, but don't get your hopes up. Those herbs are more likely to end up in medicine than in dinner. Food is fuel first, flavor second. The idea of seasoning your stew just for taste feels a little indulgent, like gilding a cracked wooden spoon. And yet, there's a strange comfort here. The meal may be bland, but it's shared. You notice how laughter still bubbles up, how stories pass around the firelight, how even in a room that smells faintly of damp wool and cabbage, people find warmth. You tear off another bite of bread, chew slowly, and realize that surviving dinner in the Middle Ages isn't just about what's on your plate. It's about enduring together. You lean back, listening to the hiss of the fire and the clatter of bowls being scraped clean. The dogs lick at the floor, making sure nothing goes to waste. Outside, the night air seeps in through gaps in the walls, cold and sharp. Tomorrow's meal will look much the same, and the day after too. But for now, the worst kitchen in history has done its job, kept hunger at bay, if only for a while. The next morning arrives not with the luxury of coffee or the sweet smell of pancakes, but with the heavy, unshakable reality of bread. The bread sits waiting, gray and dense, on the wooden board, as though it's been rehearsing all night to test the patience of your jaw. You pick it up, and the weight surprises you, heavier than you'd expect, like a stone with ambitions. You tap it lightly against the table, and it makes a hollow thud. That's not bread music, that's warning music. Bread in the Middle Ages is everywhere, and yet nowhere close to what you picture. Forget the soft, fluffy slices you can squeeze into shapes and still eat later. This bread has character. This bread has survived. It is flour mixed with water, sometimes leavened with sourdough starter, sometimes not. And in times when flour runs short, bakers get creative. Ground beans, acorns, even powdered tree bark can stretch the dough further. Historians still argue whether sawdust was ever a genuine ingredient or just a slanderous rumor used by rivals. But the fact that people believe it tells you all you need to know. You take a bite and instantly regret it. The crust cracks loudly, shards scraping the inside of your mouth like brittle glass. Inside, the crumb is dense, chewy, and carries a faint sour tang that borders on unsettling. It sticks to your teeth, to your tongue, to your very soul. You chew and chew, waiting for it to dissolve. But medieval bread doesn't dissolve. It negotiates. The people around you chew as though nothing is amiss. For them, this is daily bread, quite literally the phrase that defines survival. Without it, there is no meal. They don't complain about the grit between their teeth, because flour is ground on millstones that shed tiny fragments of stone into the mix. Dentists aren't around to protest, though historians point out that many medieval skeletons reveal severely worn-down teeth by middle age. You imagine every meal slowly sanding away your molars like wood being filed. It makes you very aware of every crunch. The bread, though, has more than one role. You notice that not all loaves are eaten outright. Some are sliced into thick slabs, used as trenchers, edible plates. Food is ladled on top, juices seeping down into the bread until the outer edges are soggy. Wealthier folks will pass these trenchers to the poor or to dogs once the meal is over, while poorer households simply eat them, juices and all. It's the medieval version of a dishwasher-safe plate, except, of course, the dishwasher is your stomach. One boy breaks his bread in half and dips it into a bowl of broth. The hard crust softens just enough to tear apart without risking his teeth. You copy him, letting the sogginess seep in. It helps. You start to see why bread is not just food here, but the anchor of every meal, the vessel for soup, the filler for hunger, the guaranteed constant in a world that has very few. Yet even bread has a hierarchy. The darker the loaf, the more likely it's bound for peasants. Rye, oats, and barley make rougher bread, while the nobility enjoy fine white wheat bread, sifted carefully to remove bran. To eat white bread is to display status, wealth, and the kind of luxury that means you never have to wonder if your bread contains last season's chestnuts. You glance down at your gray, dense hunk and know exactly where you stand in medieval society. Near the bottom, there's another problem, too: staleness. Fresh bread is a fleeting miracle. With no preservatives, loaves harden within a day, so stale bread becomes a way of life. That rock-solid loaf on the table may be 3 days old, 4 if you're unlucky. But stale doesn't mean wasted. You see someone soaking chunks in ale, another crumbling it into stew, someone else grinding it back down to thicken a new batch of pottage. Bread is too precious to discard. It comes full circle, again and again, like an edible phoenix rising from its own ashes. As you chew, endlessly chew, you hear murmurs about famine years. Bread, in those times, becomes even stranger. During the Great Famine of the early 1300s, records describe loaves bulked out with anything remotely edible. You can picture desperate bakers mixing in weeds, ground peas, even clay in some accounts. Historians still debate the accuracy of these tales, but the truth is that hunger forces creativity, and creativity rarely tastes good. Someone jokes, "At least it fills the belly." You smile weakly, but it's true. Bread is filling, even when it's not enjoyable. Your stomach eventually feels heavy, as though you've swallowed a brick. Which, in fairness, you kind of have. At one point, the loaf is sliced open to reveal something alarming: mold. Fuzzy green patches blooming across the crust, soft white streaks underneath. The family pauses, frowns, and then simply cuts around the worst of it. Waste is not an option. You hesitate, spoon halfway to your mouth, but everyone else carries on. You remind yourself, penicillin won't be discovered for centuries, so right now, that mold is not medicine, it's just dinner with extra personality. Outside, a miller walks past, dusted head to toe in fine flour. You realize how central he is to this entire world. Mills, water-driven, wind-driven, are the heartbeat of bread making. Without mills, you're stuck pounding grain by hand with mortar and pestle, a task so time-consuming that it could eat your day before you eat your bread. The miller is a powerful figure, sometimes resented for charging fees or keeping a little extra flour for himself. There are even tales of millers cheating customers, skimming grain here and there. Villagers grumble, but depend on him nonetheless. Bread ties everyone together, for better or worse. As the day wears on, you notice how bread shows up at every meal. Morning, bread dipped in ale. Midday, bread with a smear of cheese, if you're lucky. Evening, bread beside the stew. It is unescapable, relentless, omnipresent. It defines life and survival in ways that make your jaw ache just thinking about it. Later, someone sets aside the smallest portion of bread for the family's religious observances. The symbolism of bread runs deep, after all. It isn't just food, it's spiritual. "Give us this day our daily bread" isn't a metaphor here. It's a prayer you feel in your stomach. Without bread, hunger gnaws, and hunger, in the medieval world, is is always just a poor harvest away. By the time you try to rest that night, the bread is still sitting heavily in your stomach, like an uninvited guest who won't leave. You roll onto your side, listening to the creak of the cottage, the distant bark of a dog, the faint wind rattling through the thatch. Bread has become more than food. It is constant, stubborn, sometimes cruel, but always there, holding everyone together through hunger and harvest, feast and famine. And as you drift toward sleep, you know that tomorrow, and the day after, and the week beyond, bread will greet you again. Waiting on the table, gray, heavy, unyielding. The medieval companion you never asked for but cannot avoid. The morning after bread greets you again, you wake to the smell of something simmering on the hearth. Your hopes rise briefly, but then reality sets in. It's gruel. You shuffle to the table, rubbing the sleep from your eyes, and see bowls lined up, each one waiting to be filled with the same pale, lumpy concoction. The spoon dips into the pot, and you hear that familiar slop of thin porridge being ladled out. Steam curls upward, carrying a faint scent of oats or barley. But mostly, it just smells like damp grain and smoke. This, you realize, is the medieval idea of variety: porridge for breakfast, pottage for lunch, maybe porridge again at supper, if you're truly unlucky. You sit down with your bowl, which looks suspiciously like yesterday's bowl of mush, only slightly runnier. You take a cautious sip. It's warm, yes, and it fills your stomach, but flavor, that's another matter. There's no honey to sweeten it, no cinnamon to sprinkle on top, no milk unless you live near a cow and can spare some. It's just grain and water, boiled until it gives up any semblance of personality. The texture is gluey, clinging to your tongue like it wants to redecorate your mouth. Across the table, a child digs in eagerly, licking the spoon with enthusiasm, and you realize that hunger changes standards. What feels bland to you is comfort to them, a guarantee that the day begins with something warm. Still, it's hard not to notice that gruel looks exactly like what it is: survival in a bowl. Porridge and pottage are the twin pillars of medieval dining, and sometimes the words even blur together. Porridge is more breakfast-like, made with grains, while pottage is the stew of vegetables, beans, maybe scraps of meat. Both are endlessly adjustable, depending on what the garden or the marketplace can provide. Historians still debate how often peasants truly went without vegetables, since even the poorest households usually grew cabbages, leeks, and turnips. But one fact is certain: monotony ruled. Grain mush in the morning, boiled vegetables in the evening, on repeat until you lost count of the days. You glance down at your bowl, wondering how long this same pot has been bubbling. Because here's the thing about medieval cooking: it doesn't stop. The pot on the fire is never truly emptied. It's a perpetual stew, constantly topped up with whatever ingredients are at hand. Cabbage today, beans tomorrow, maybe barley the next day. The flavors mix, merge, and sometimes curdle together in unexpected ways. You can almost taste last week lingering faintly in the background. The texture varies wildly too. Sometimes the pottage is thin, closer to a soup, the broth sloshing around with a few lonely turnips bobbing on the surface. Other times it thickens to the consistency of paste, clinging stubbornly to the spoon. And if the fire burns too hot, you get the occasional scorched bottom layer, lending every spoonful a hint of smoke and bitterness. People scrape it up anyway. Waste isn't tolerated, not when every mouthful matters. You dip your spoon again and notice how communal the act is. Everyone around the table eats from the same pot or from bowls filled directly from it. No one complains about double dipping, and no one seems to care when someone's sleeve brushes into the stew. Hygiene is not the priority here, calories are. Dogs circle under the table, hopeful for scraps, and small hands dart in to grab bits of bread to dunk into the porridge. It's chaotic, messy, and oddly cozy, like a family ritual that repeats endlessly. Sometimes, if the household is lucky, a chunk of bacon or salted pork is added. It flavors the whole pot, though the meat itself may vanish quickly. The rich, smoky taste clings to the broth, fooling your tongue into believing it's heartier than it really is. Other times, dried peas are the star, lending a thick, greenish heft to the stew. They don't taste like much, but they do their job, fill the belly, stretch the meal. And occasionally, very occasionally, spices might find their way in. A pinch of pepper, a scrap of garlic, a sprinkle of mustard seed. These moments feel miraculous, like winning a medieval lottery. Your spoon lifts to your lips, and for once, the flavor surprises you. But those days are rare, reserved for moments of festival or luck. Most of the time, porridge is gray, pottage is brown, and both are bland. As you eat, you remember stories you've overheard about monasteries, where monks also lived on porridge and pottage. In fact, some monasteries were known for growing beans and cabbages, specifically to keep their pots filled. Records show monks often added fish or cheese to their stews, elevating them above the peasant's fare. Still, whether you're a peasant in a drafty hut or a monk in a cloister, the daily grind of mush remains the same. The conversation at the table turns to famine years again. During the Great Famine, even porridge could disappear. People boiled weeds, roots, and anything vaguely edible into thin gruel. There are even grim tales of bark being stripped from trees, ground into powder, and boiled into broth. Historians still argue about how widespread those practices were, but famine has a way of bending truth into necessity. You stir your bowl a little slower, grateful at least that today's gruel is actual grain. Someone next to you cracks a joke about how porridge doesn't spoil because nobody notices if it has. You laugh, though nervously, because they're not entirely wrong. A pot that simmers day after day can ferment slightly, souring at the edges, but it's still eaten. The sourness just becomes another layer of flavor, like an accidental seasoning. Your spoon pauses halfway to your mouth, and you decide you'd rather not think too hard about that. And yet, despite its flaws, there's something comforting about porridge and pottage. They're predictable, dependable. They might be boring, but they're steady, in a world where steady is rare. You watch the firelight flicker against the cauldron, the the steam rising into the smoky rafters, and you realize this humble stew has been keeping people alive for centuries. It doesn't win prizes, but it does its job. Later in the day, when you pass through the marketplace, you see how central these dishes are. Grain merchants hawk sacks of oats, barley, and rye. Vegetable sellers display leeks, onions, and turnips, the backbone of every pottage. The smell of cabbage hangs in the air, sharp and familiar. A pot of something is always simmering, always waiting. It's the medieval soundtrack, bubbling stew, crackling fire, slurping spoons. That night, back at the table, another bowl is set before you. Different day, same mush. You sigh, scoop, chew, and swallow. The taste hasn't changed, but maybe you have. Maybe you're starting to understand that in this world, food isn't about excitement. It's about endurance. The fire pops loudly, making you jump, and someone laughs at your expense. You smile sheepishly, spoon halfway to your mouth again. Around you, people eat with the same slow determination as always, scraping every last bit from their bowls. When the pot is finally empty, someone pours in more water, tosses in a handful of beans, and sets it back on the fire. Tomorrow's stew has already begun, and so the cycle continues, day after day, bowl after bowl. Gruel for breakfast, pottage for dinner, porridge when the mood strikes. It never really ends, just shifts slightly in shade and thickness. You lay down that night with the taste still clinging faintly to your tongue, knowing it will greet you again in the morning. By the time another evening rolls around, you start to hope for something different, something that doesn't slosh or cling or arrive in a wooden bowl with a damp piece of bread. And then you hear the word whispered like a promise: meat. Your ears perk up, your stomach rumbles with a mix of anticipation and skepticism, because meat is rare. Meat is a celebration, an indulgence, the kind of thing you daydream about when chewing through yet another turnip. But tonight, you're told, there will be meat on the table. You watch the butcher arrive earlier in the day, and it's clear this isn't the glossy butcher's shop you might imagine from a modern high street. This is a man with a block of wood, stained dark with years of work, a cleaver that has seen better days, and a bucket that smells faintly of iron and salt. His stall is simple, his offerings laid out without refrigeration, flies buzzing lazily in the late afternoon air. Cuts of meat hang from hooks, some recognizable, others suspiciously vague. The air carries a sharp, metallic tang that tells you this is fresh, if fresh means recently alive. You glance closer and realize something. You won't be choosing ribeye or filet here. You'll take what's left, what you can afford, and what hasn't spoiled yet. Choice isn't really part of the menu. Sometimes, meat is sold salted or smoked to keep it from rotting, but even then, preserved might be too optimistic a word. Salted pork can be so hard you need to soak it in water for hours before it even thinks about softening. Smoked meat sometimes tastes more of the smoke than the animal. And fresh meat, well, fresh means you'd better eat it before the sun goes down, because tomorrow it will already be questionable. When the butcher begins to chop, it's a messy business. Bone fragments fly, fat splatters, and the cleaver smacks down with a sound that makes you flinch. A dog snatches a stray scrap and darts away before anyone can stop it. The butcher shrugs. That's part of the business. Losses are inevitable, and hygiene isn't exactly a priority. The wooden block is wiped with a rag that has seen better centuries, and then it's on to the next customer. Ends up in your household pot. Isn't a neat cut, but something closer to scraps. A bit of gristle, a fatty strip, maybe a piece of offal if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on your taste. Offal is popular among those who can't afford prime cuts, which means peasants eat a lot of liver, heart, and kidneys. They're rich in nutrition, but they also come with a flavor that requires courage, especially when not cooked with the benefit of herbs or spices. Still, you don't complain. Protein is protein. By the time it's your turn to try some, the meat has been boiled into the pottage. It floats among the turnips and barley, lending a richness to the broth. The smell is stronger, more savory, with a hint of fat that feels luxurious compared to the watery porridge you've grown used to. You take a bite, and it's chewy, perhaps a little tough, but undeniably satisfying. The richness coats your tongue in a way vegetables never could. You savor it, even as you gnaw through a stubborn sinew. The family around you eats eagerly, some with greasy fingers, some tearing the meat apart with their teeth. There are no forks. Those are centuries away from common use, so it's knives, spoons, and hands. The children suck on bones, eyes wide with delight, scraping off every last bit of marrow. Dogs wrestle under the table for discarded scraps, adding their own soundtrack of growls and yips to the meal. You pause to think about how meat is tied to status. Nobles feast on roasted boar, venison, swan, even peacock, their tables groaning with dishes. Meanwhile, peasants count themselves lucky to gnaw on a sliver of salted pork once a week. Historians still debate how much meat peasants realistically ate, with some arguing it was almost non-existent, and others suggesting that rural folk with access to pigs or chickens may have eaten more than we assume. What's clear, though, is that the rich monopolized hunting rights. If you're caught poaching a deer from the Lord's forest, you could face brutal punishment. So the forest full of game remains tantalizingly close, yet legally untouchable. The meat that peasants do manage often comes from animals they raise themselves. Pigs that forage in the woods, chickens that scratch in the yard, occasionally a goat or sheep. But animals are valuable alive for milk, eggs, wool, so slaughtering them is a serious decision. It usually happens when the animal is too old to be productive, which means your stew might feature a chicken that lived a long, stringy life. You taste the toughness and nod grimly. Yes, this was not a spring chicken. Preservation is another hurdle. Without refrigeration, meat must be salted, dried, or smoked. You've already tasted salted pork so tough it could double as a roof tile, but dried fish jerky and smoked sausage are just as stubborn on the teeth. Still, these preserved foods are essential in winter, when fresh meat is impossible to come by. The taste is secondary. Survival is the goal. The idea of butchery also extends beyond pigs and cows. Rabbits, Hares, geese, ducks, pigeons, all are fair game if you can catch them. And then there are the more unusual options. Hedgehogs roasted after being encased in clay to burn off the spines, or eels pulled wriggling from rivers. You shudder at the thought, but in a world without supermarkets, you eat what's available. Hunger doesn't allow much pickiness. The conversation at dinner turns to feast days. Someone recalls seeing a noble's table laden with whole roasted animals. A boar's head garnished with apples, a goose stuffed with herbs, a pie that hides live birds ready to flutter out when cut open. You can almost see it, golden and extravagant, the kind of meal that doubles as entertainment. Meanwhile, your stew is more practical, less flashy, but equally precious in its own way. You chew your fatty strip and try not to imagine the peacock with its feathers reattached for display. One older man reminisces about Martinmas, the November festival when animals were slaughtered for winter. The air thick with the smell of smokehouses, the salty tang of curing meats, the promise of preserved food to last through cold months. It's a time of plenty, fleeting though it may be. The rest of the year is leaner, relying on scraps and vegetables. You can hear the longing in his voice as he describes it, and then someone brings up the issue of spoiled meat. Without proper preservation, it happens often. Sometimes, spices are used to disguise the off taste, though not everyone can afford them. Sometimes, vinegar or strong ale is poured over to mask the smell. You glance down at your bowl and wonder, is this savory richness actual freshness or clever disguise? The thought makes you hesitate, but then hunger wins. You eat anyway, because what else is there to do? The evening winds down, and the bones are gnawed clean, sucked dry of marrow. The pot is scraped empty, greasy fingerprints smear the edges of bowls, and the dogs finish what's left on the floor. You lean back, full in a way that porridge never achieves. Meat is a rare treat, a reminder of flavor and strength, even if it arrives in suspicious cuts and questionable freshness. Later, lying on your straw mattress, you can still taste the richness coating your teeth. You think about how different life might be if meat were plentiful, if every meal carried this sense of satisfaction. But you also know that tomorrow, it will likely be back to cabbage, back to porridge, back to bread. Tonight was a lucky break, a fleeting glimpse of luxury in a world where survival doesn't always come with seasoning. The next day begins, and while your jaw is still tender from the chewy meat of last night, the smell in the air tells you something different is on its way. The scent is sharper, brinier, and carries the faint hint of low tide, even though you are nowhere near the sea. It can only mean one thing: fish. Not because it's a fisherman's market day, not because someone reeled in a fat salmon from the river, but because the church said so. Friday has arrived, and that means fish day, whether you're excited about it or not. In the medieval calendar, meatless days are constant companions. Fridays, Lent, Ember days, Vigil days at times. Nearly half the year is taken up by restrictions against eating meat. You may think this would give you more variety, but in practice, it just means fish is everywhere. And when fish is everywhere without refrigeration, you can imagine how it smells. The church mandates fasting and abstinence, not to torture you, at least not officially, but to turn your thoughts toward devotion. Yet, as you look into the pot bubbling over the fire, it's hard to feel holy about the prospect of salted herring. Fish days stretch across society, though the wealthy endure them differently. Nobles import fresh eels, sturgeons, or even exotic sea fish transported in barrels of salt. They prepare intricate dishes with sauces, spices, and herbs that almost make you forget you're supposed to be fasting. Meanwhile, peasants turn to preserved herring, dried cod, or whatever freshwater catch can be pulled from local rivers and ponds. And sometimes, in the endless creativity of defining fish, people stretch the category to its limits. Beavers, with their tails that resemble fins, are occasionally considered fish. Some monks even argued that barnacle geese counted as fish, since they believed they hatched from driftwood on the sea. Historians still debate how seriously these claims were taken, but the fact that anyone tried suggests just how desperate people were for variety. Your bowl is ladled full, and you peer down at the murky broth. Bits of fish float uncertainly, skin curling, eyes staring blankly as if accusing you of this whole arrangement. The smell is strong, salty, sour, faintly rancid. You brace yourself and take a bite. The taste is overwhelming. Salt first, so much salt it makes your tongue ache, then a chewy fleshiness that dissolves reluctantly, leaving behind a faint bitterness that sticks in the throat. This is no fresh catch. This is preservation at work. Fish dried in the sun or packed in barrels of salt until its natural flavor was long gone. The children beside you eat with less hesitation, tearing at chunks of herring with their hands, sucking the salty flesh from bones. Dogs circle under the table as usual, quick to snatch anything that slips. You chew carefully, trying not to choke on the countless tiny bones hiding in every mouthful. Fish bones are part of the deal, and you either learn to work around them or you suffer. As you eat, you think about how central fish is to trade. The herring trade in the North Sea is booming. Cod fleets from Scandinavia supply vast markets, and salted fish becomes a staple in cities far from the coast. In fact, entire towns build their economies around fishing seasons, with markets bustling when ships return laden with barrels. Fish is not just food, it's commerce, it's church regulation, it's survival. But for you, it's also monotony. The taste lingers, stubbornly clinging to your tongue no matter how much ale you wash it down with. And ale is necessary, because salted fish makes you thirsty in ways porridge never could. You take long gulps, the liquid cutting the brine, but never quite banishing it. You wonder how anyone can endure this week after week, year after year. And then you realize they don't endure. They simply accept. Someone at the table chuckles about the story of St. Cuthbert, who supposedly lived on nothing but fish and water for long stretches. Another recalls how monks on strict fasts grew inventive, finding loopholes by labeling certain animals as honorary fish. Beavers, barnacle geese, even puffins, all slipped into the fasting diet at one point or another. It's almost comforting to know that even centuries ago, people were finding ways to bend the rules. Still, there are moments of delight. When fish is fresh, pulled from a river that very morning, grilled over an open fire with a sprig of herbs, the taste is different. Clean, light, almost sweet. You close your eyes and try to imagine that version of fish as you chew another leathery bite of salted herring. Maybe someday you'll catch a trout and roast it simply, without salt, without barrels. But not today. Today is another day of fish because the church says so. Later in the day, walking near the river, you see villagers hauling in nets heavy with wriggling silver. Children splash at the edges, trying to catch minnows in their hands. The smell of mud and riverweed rises, strong, but somehow less offensive than the barrel of salted herring back at the cottage. You watch as the catch is sorted. Bigger fish for the table, smaller ones dried in the sun for later. Nothing goes to waste. Even fish heads find their way into broth. That evening, the pot is back on the fire, this time with eels. Slippery, snake-like, they writhe in memory as you lift a spoonful. The flesh is softer than herring, almost gelatinous, with a taste that lingers long after swallowing. People around you eat with relish, and you try to match their enthusiasm. But it's difficult when the texture reminds you of something that belongs in the river, not the pot. Still, you chew, swallow, and smile faintly, because this is what food is here, strange, relentless, necessary. As the night winds down, you hear stories of great fish feasts at monasteries, where dozens of dishes are served during Lent. Pies of lamprey, stews of salmon, elaborate constructions that make fasting feel more like feasting. The irony isn't lost on you. For the poor, fish days mean salt and bones. For the rich, fish days mean variety and indulgence. You can't help but laugh softly at the imbalance, though your laugh turns into a cough as a fish bone pricks your throat. You take another gulp of ale to wash it down. When you finally lie down to sleep, the smell of fish clings to your hands, your clothes, even the straw you rest on. It seeps into everything, a reminder that fish days are inescapable. You close your eyes and try to imagine sweeter smells, fresh bread, roasted meat, even cabbage. Anything but the briny persistence of herring. Tomorrow may bring something different, but for now, you drift into uneasy sleep with the aftertaste of the church's dietary rules lingering on your tongue. Morning creeps in with the sound of roosters and the faint scrape of someone tending the hearth. But before you even open your eyes, you smell it. Not fresh bread, not roasted meat, but cabbage. Again, the sour, earthy tang fills the room, creeping into your nose like an uninvited guest. Your stomach turns a little, not because you dislike cabbage, but because it has been following you around for days, lurking in every meal like a persistent relative who refuses to leave. You roll over and stare at the rafters, listening to the bubbling pot. You know exactly what it contains. A stew, thin and watery, with a handful of chopped cabbage floating around like pale green ghosts. Maybe, if fortune smiled, a scrap of onion or leek has been tossed in too. And if someone was especially reckless yesterday, there might even be a shred of pork fat to give the whole thing flavor. but mostly it's just cabbage. Cabbage is a mainstay in medieval peasant diets for one very practical reason. It grows. It grows in cold soil, in damp weather, in rough patches of land where more delicate crops sulk and wither. It grows stubbornly, heartily, in tight little heads that keep reasonably well when stored in pits or cellars. It's food security wrapped in thick leaves. And so you eat it. Again and again and again. The bowl is pressed into your hands, steam rising in little curls. You take a sip. The broth is weak, almost like warm water, with only the faintest whisper of vegetable sweetness. Then comes the cabbage itself, soft but fibrous, tasting both sharp and bland at the same time. It's one of those paradoxes only cabbage can achieve. You chew slowly, feeling the fibers string between your teeth, and you can't help but think of the countless bowls you've already eaten and the countless more yet to come. There's no escaping cabbage. It appears at breakfast, lunch, and supper, sometimes plain, sometimes partnered with turnips, sometimes boiled until it collapses into mush. On rare days, it's transformed into sauerkraut, fermented, tangy, and oddly refreshing. Fermentation is the one trick that makes cabbage interesting, but it's not always worth the wait. Most days, you just get the boiled version, floating aimlessly in broth, or slapped onto bread as a filler. It's not that cabbage is bad. It keeps you alive. It has vitamins you don't know the name of, but your body craves them nonetheless. Without cabbage and its leafy cousins, entire winters would be unbearable. Scurvy would creep in, and you'd be far weaker. But that doesn't mean you're excited about it. It means you learn to endure it, spoonful after spoonful. A neighbor sitting beside you chuckles, muttering that cabbage makes the man. You smile weakly, though your stomach tightens at the thought of what comes after cabbage, namely, the inevitable bloating and gas. Whole families share cramped cottages, so the aftereffects of cabbage are everybody's problem. There's no privacy in digestion. You remember once overhearing someone call cabbage the poor man's trumpet, and you can't help but laugh quietly into your bowl. Later in the day, while tending to chores, you pass the garden where rows of cabbage stand proudly, round and full, as if mocking your discontent. Their waxy leaves catch the light, their centers hidden and compact, promising yet more meals to come. You sigh, knowing that come harvest, those heads will be gathered, stored, and eaten until you can't tell one meal from the next. Cabbage has a darker side, too. Poor storage can make it rot quickly, and when it does, the smell is overpowering, sharp, sulfurous, like a punch in the nose. Sometimes you wonder if the rotting cabbage smells worse than the fresh boiled version. Either way, there's no avoiding it. In good times or bad, cabbage stays by your side. That evening, you gather again around the fire. Tonight's meal is no different, though someone has tried to liven it up by throwing in barley. The grains float among the cabbage, swollen and soft, giving the stew a bit more body. It's almost filling, almost satisfying. Almost. You chew through another mouthful, pretending it's heartier than it really is. But the truth is you're still hungry. That's the curse of cabbage. It fills the stomach, but it rarely satisfies. While you eat, someone tells a story about how cabbage was once considered medicinal. Monks wrote about it in herbals, praising it for curing headaches, stomach ailments, and even preventing drunkenness if eaten before wine. Historians still argue whether people truly believed cabbage could counteract alcohol, but the story persists, passed from one table to another. You glance at the cabbage in your bowl and wonder if it's true. Probably not, you think. But it's nice to imagine cabbage has some hidden power besides tormenting your digestion. As the fire crackles, another villager recalls how Roman soldiers supposedly carried cabbage with them to ward off illness. The idea that such a simple, humble plant once marched across empires makes you laugh quietly. It seems no matter where you are in history, cabbage is always there, haunting kitchens and stomachs alike. You finish your bowl, wiping the last bits with a crust of bread. The taste lingers stubbornly, that unmistakable cabbage tang clinging to your mouth. You know you'll taste it again later, when you burp quietly into your blanket, trying not to disturb the others sleeping nearby. That's the rhythm of cabbage life. Eat, endure, repeat. As you settle into your straw mattress, you think of how monotonous medieval food can be. Bread, porridge, cabbage, fish, then back to cabbage again. The cycle never really breaks. And yet, somehow, people survive. Not happily, perhaps, but persistently. You can't help but smile at the irony. The thing that frustrates you most, the endless cabbage, is also the very thing keeping you alive. And as sleep creeps in, you hear the faint bubbling of tomorrow's pot, already being prepared. You don't even need to guess what's inside. You wake to the sound of rain again, the steady patter on the thatched roof above you. The dampness has crept into the cottage overnight, clinging to your clothes, making the straw beneath you smell faintly of mildew. You know today's meal won't chase that dampness away. It will be something humble, something thin, something that feels like a cruel joke when your belly aches for more. A clay bowl is set in front of you, and you peer down into the contents with a mix of resignation and mild dread. It's gruel, just gruel. A slurry of oats boiled in water until it's halfway between soup and paste, with no salt, no sweetener, not even a splash of milk to soften the monotony. You lift the spoon, the liquid sliding back with a slow reluctance, as if it doesn't even want to be eaten. Gruel is the food of survival. It's quick, it's cheap, and it uses whatever grain is at hand: oats, barley, rye, sometimes millet. Families make it when there's not enough to bake bread, or when supplies are stretched so thin that every grain has to count. It's not terrible, exactly. It fills your stomach, keeps you standing, and doesn't take much fuel to prepare. But it's dull, utterly dull. The first spoonful hits your tongue like warm wallpaper paste. It has a faint, earthy flavor, the ghost of grain that might have been tasty if baked into bread. You chew even though there's little to chew, because chewing makes it feel like you're eating something more substantial. A neighbor beside you mutters, "Better than nothing," which is true, though not especially comforting, As you swallow, you remember how scholars once described medieval diets: monotonous and repetitive. Gruel is the perfect example of that. Day in, day out, you face the same bowl of pale sludge, and you learn to live with it. You know it keeps you alive, but part of you wonders whether life is really being lived at all when every morning tastes exactly like the last. To make gruel more tolerable, people sometimes added whatever they could scavenge: an onion, a bit of cabbage, of course, or a scrap of dried herb. In the wealthier houses, honey might sweeten the pot, or milk might turn it into something closer to porridge. But for you, there's none of that. Just water, grain, and the faint taste of smoke from the fire it was boiled over. Gruel has an unfortunate reputation, too. Even centuries later, people still imagine gruel as punishment food, the kind handed to prisoners, orphans, and the poorest of the poor. And here you are, spoon in hand, living that cliché. You smile faintly at the absurdity. If only you could tell future generations. Yes, the stereotype is true. And no, it doesn't get better. Your spoon scrapes the bottom of the bowl, and you chase the last thin streaks. Hunger drives you to finish every drop, though you don't feel any more satisfied than when you started. Gruel fills, but it doesn't stay with you. Within an hour, your stomach will growl again, like an impatient dog demanding more. Later, as you work in the fields, you think about how gruel ties into the larger rhythm of medieval life. You eat it because it's simple, because fuel for cooking is scarce, and because it makes the most of what little grain you have. Bread requires grinding, kneading, baking, and above all, fuel for the oven. Gruel just requires a pot and a fire. Efficiency wins, even if your taste buds lose. The rain continues, and by midday, you're wet, chilled, and already daydreaming about your next bowl. Not because you crave it, but because you know it's waiting for you, like an unavoidable destiny. Sure enough, supper brings another pot of gruel, this time slightly thicker, with a shred of carrot floating in it like a rare treasure. Someone jokes that you'd better savor it, because that carrot might be the last you see this week. You laugh, because it's either laugh or despair. As you eat, an old man at the table starts talking about how gruel has been around forever. The Romans ate it, he says, and monks wrote recipes for it in their manuscripts. Historians still argue whether gruel was seen as a humble meal or a proper staple. But one thing is clear: it never went away. You can almost picture legionaries spooning up the same tasteless slop 2,000 years earlier. There's some strange comfort in knowing that you're part of an unbroken tradition of disappointment. You glance around the table and see children slurping their bowls without complaint. To them, gruel is normal, expected. They don't know there's a world where food might taste better, where flavor might matter as much as fullness. For a moment, you envy them. They eat without resentment. You, on the other hand, eat while quietly imagining roast chicken, spiced wine, or even just bread thick with butter. Night comes, and the cottage is quiet, except for the occasional cough or snore. Your belly rumbles softly, reminding you that even after 2 bowls of gruel, you're still not fully satisfied. You turn over in the straw and think about tomorrow. You already know what breakfast will be. You already know the taste, the texture, the way it will sit heavy yet unsatisfying in your stomach. Gruel doesn't surprise you. It never will. And as your eyes close, you accept that this is how it goes. Morning, noon, and night, the same warm slurry. Bland, dependable, inevitable. You don't love it, but you need it. And in the end, maybe that's the truest definition of medieval food. You shuffle out into the pale morning light, and there it is again, the ever-present reminder of how repetitive medieval meals really are. Today, though, instead of gruel, you're facing bread. But not the kind you're picturing. Not golden loaves with a crisp crust and a soft, warm center. No, this bread is dark, dense, and closer in personality to a brick than to anything you'd find in a modern bakery. You pick it up, feel its weight in your hand, and briefly wonder if it could double as a weapon. This is rye bread, though in some seasons it might be barley or maslin, a mix of rye and wheat. White wheat bread exists, of course, but only the wealthy get that privilege. You're stuck with the dark stuff, the kind that feels like it's punishing you for daring to be hungry. It's coarse, chewy, and carries the faint tang of sourness that comes from dough left to ferment a bit too long. Still, it's food, and you take a bite. Your teeth grind through the tough crust, and you notice the grittiness almost immediately. Medieval bread often wasn't milled with the care you'd expect. Stone querns ground the flour, but tiny fragments of stone ended up in the dough. And over time, those bits wore down people's teeth. You can almost hear the future dentist sighing in despair, though here in your present moment, the only sound is your jaw working against what feels like a mouthful of gravel. Bread is everywhere in your world. It's the foundation of nearly every meal, the thing you measure life by. Some families bake weekly, carefully rationing loaves to last until the next batch. Others, less fortunate, have to stretch whatever grain they have into flatbreads or thin cakes, hoping to trick themselves into feeling satisfied. Whatever form it takes, bread is survival. It's not exciting, but it's constant. The loaf in front of you isn't just bread, it's also a dish, a plate, and sometimes even a sponge. Trenchers, those thick slabs of stale bread, serve as the foundation for meals. Stew or meat, if you're lucky, is piled on top, the bread soaking up juices, turning soft and heavy. When you finish eating, you either chew through the sodden bread or pass it along to beggars, servants, or even animals. Nothing is wasted, not when food is this precious. You take another bite and notice the faint bitterness of rye. Rye thrives where wheat struggles, in poorer soils and colder climates. That's why so many peasants live on it. It's what will grow when nothing else does. You chew slowly, trying to appreciate it. But appreciation is difficult when every mouthful feels like it's both feeding and scouring you at once. Someone jokes that at least you won't need to polish your teeth, since the bread is doing the job for you. You laugh, but with a wince. Bread also carries risk. When the harvest is poor, rye can be infected with ergot, a fungus that thrives in damp conditions. People call it St. Anthony's fire, and it brings with it visions, convulsions, and the burning sensation of limbs as if fire is crawling through your veins. Entire communities have suffered outbreaks, hallucinating demons or saints, writhing in agony because their daily bread was poisoned without them knowing. You glance at your loaf, suddenly suspicious, but hunger wins, as it always does. You eat because what else is there? The sameness of bread makes you long for variety. Historians still argue whether peasants ever grew tired of their staple foods, but you're living proof that monotony wears on the spirit as much as hunger wears on the body. Every chew feels like déjà vu. You think of future centuries when bread will be soft, white, and fluffy, sold in neat slices, perfect for sandwiches. If only you could fast forward. But no, you're here, jaw aching, stomach halfway satisfied, and already resigned to eating this again tomorrow. In the afternoon, you pass by a mill, and you hear the rhythmic grinding of the stones. Inside, dust floats in the air, coating everything in a fine layer of flour. Millers are notorious in this age, often accused of skimming off the grain, taking a portion for themselves. You wonder if the miller cheated you this week, if the flour you brought back was lighter than it should have been. But there's no proving it, and bread is bread, however little you have. Later, you sit with others around the communal table, breaking loaves, dipping pieces into thin ale to soften them. This is your dinner, bread and ale, the classic pairing of peasant life. It doesn't sound terrible until you realize both are weak. Both are meant to sustain rather than delight. You dip, chew, swallow, repeat. The conversation drifts to weather, crops, and rumors from the next village. The bread sits heavy in your stomach, not because it's filling, but because it's dense enough to feel like ballast. As evening falls, you notice children picking at their crusts, gnawing slowly, making a game of softening the bread with their teeth before swallowing. They'll grow up never knowing bread could be light, sweet, or fragrant with herbs. For them, this dark loaf is normal, the taste of life itself. You envy their acceptance, though you can't quite mimic it. To you, every bite reminds you of what's missing. Still, there are moments of relief. On feast days, bread might be made with finer flour, even wheat if you're lucky. Those loaves are paler, softer, a glimpse of luxury in an otherwise hard diet. You dream of those days, counting them down, knowing that at least then, bread won't feel like a chore. Until then, you chew through the grit, swallow the heaviness, and remind yourself that this is survival. You lie down at night, jaw sore, belly half full, and you think about how bread defines you more than any other food. It shapes your teeth, your body, your health, even your risks. It gives you energy to keep going, but it never lets you forget how precarious life is. One bad harvest, one infected loaf, one dishonest miller, and bread could betray you. Yet tomorrow, you'll reach for it again, because you must. Bread is boring, but it's everything. The next day greets you with the familiar dull ache of hunger. And as always, you go in search of whatever might fill the void. Today, though, instead of bread or thin stew, you're faced with something that looks almost like a miracle meat. A haunch of pork lies on the rough wooden table, and everyone's eyes are fixed on it, as though a relic has just been unveiled. Meat is rare for peasants, far too expensive to be a daily indulgence. So when it appears, it's an event. Your mouth waters instinctively, though you know better than to let hope get too high. The cut is salted and a bit gray around the edges. Preservation isn't subtle in this era. Fresh meat doesn't stay fresh for long, and with no refrigeration, salting, smoking, and drying are the only defenses against decay. The pork has been soaked in salt so heavily that it feels more like a mineral block than a piece of food. You know that when you bite into it, the salt will dominate everything, scraping your tongue raw. Still, hunger overrides hesitation, and you slice off a piece. The taste is exactly as expected, salty, tough, and with a faint undertone that suggests it's already gone a bit off. You chew and chew, jaw working like a grindstone. The meat has no tenderness, no juices dripping, just fibers straining against your teeth. Still, there's protein here, and your body recognizes it as strength, even if your taste buds are begging for mercy. You swallow, throat dry, and immediately reach for ale to wash it down. This is feast food for you, but for the wealthy, meat is constant. Nobles dine on venison, swan, pheasant, and roast beef, their tables groaning with roasted joints dripping fat. You gnaw on salted pork and stringy mutton, thankful even for scraps. The contrast is so sharp, it almost feels cruel. And when you remember that the nobility sometimes kept hunting lands off limits to peasants, even if your family was starving, the bitterness intensifies. You imagine yourself sneaking into the forest, snaring a rabbit, only to face harsh punishment if caught. The forest is full of life, but you're barred from it. The irony tastes worse than the pork. Your neighbor talks about how much harder meat is to chew as he gets older, teeth worn down from bread and grit. You nod, thinking about how medieval diets aren't kind to bodies. Scholars still debate just how much meat peasants had in their diets, some arguing it was only on holidays, others saying it was more common, but always the cheapest cuts. Either way, you know firsthand that, when it does appear, it's never luxurious. The methods of cooking don't help much either. Meat is usually boiled in large pots, turning into a pale, tough lump that tastes only of salt water. Roasting is a luxury, requiring space, equipment, and fuel, all things in short supply. So your meat ends up boiled until lifeless, often tossed into a pot with cabbage, leeks, or whatever scraps of vegetables are lying around. The broth carries more flavor than the meat itself, and often people fight over who gets the liquid instead of the solid. You drink yours, the salty warmth filling your belly, and silently thank the broth for existing. Sometimes you think about the animals themselves. Pigs are common, wandering around villages, eating whatever refuse they can find. Chickens scratch at the dirt, and if you're lucky, you might get an egg or two, though most are saved for market. Cows are more valuable alive, giving milk, so eating beef is less common unless an animal is too old or sick. Every bite of meat carries a cost far greater than taste. And then there's fish. If you live near a river or the coast, fish plays a bigger role in your diet, especially on religious fasting days when meat is forbidden. But fish, too, gets salted and dried, losing its freshness and turning into something closer to leathery jerky than the flaky, tender fillets you dream about. Some monks claim fish is a holy substitute for meat, but after chewing on salted herring for the 5th day in a row, you're not sure holiness is worth this kind of monotony. The salt lingers in your mouth long after you finish. You think about how people joke today about salty snacks, but here, salt isn't seasoning its survival. Without it, meat rots with it. Meat becomes a punishment. You crave balance, maybe a slice of fresh fruit, or even a handful of herbs to cut through the brine. But those are luxuries you don't have. As evening settles in, you gather with others around the table, each person pulling small scraps from the shared pot. The meat is stringy, but the fat softens the broth a little, giving it richness that plain vegetables lack. For once, you feel your hunger ease, even if the taste is far from satisfying. A child slurps the broth loudly, eyes shining as though it's the best thing they've ever had. You envy their innocence, their ability to turn scarcity into joy. Someone mentions the nobles feast up at the manor, how tables there are groaning with roasted birds stuffed with spices, with sauces thickened by almonds and flavored with cinnamon. You all laugh, not because it's funny, but because imagining such meals feels like fantasy. You'll never taste cinnamon, never chew on roasted goose stuffed with dried fruits, but the thought is oddly comforting. At least someone is eating well, even if it isn't you. Later, as you lick the last salty film from your lips, you realize that meat in your world is more symbol than sustenance. It's a marker of status, a reminder of your place in the hierarchy. You eat it rarely, and when you do, it's never the best, but you cling to it all the same. Because when meat arrives on the table, even in its driest, toughest, most salted form, it feels like a moment of plenty, a rare break from bread and porridge. You stretch out in your bed, stomach full for once, and you let yourself drift towards sleep. But even then, you can't help imagining what meat could be: soft, tender, juicy, seasoned with herbs instead of drowned in salt. You wonder if anyone in the future will ever complain about too much meat, about too many choices, about seasoning being too strong. The thought makes you chuckle quietly. If only they knew. The next morning begins with that familiar heaviness in your stomach, not because you are overfull, but because yesterday's salted pork is still sitting there like a brick. You wake with a dry mouth, tongue rough as parchment, and all you crave is water. But water is, as ever, suspicious. The bucket by the door has been standing overnight, and you can see flecks drifting lazily on the surface. You scoop some into a cup, squint at it, and decide you'll wait until it's boiled. Until then, it's ale again, weak, thin, slightly sour, but safer. You sigh as you drink, remembering that modern people can open a tap and trust what flows. Here, every sip is a gamble, but this day isn't about meat or water. Today, you're struck by what isn't on your table: fruit, vegetables, and anything remotely resembling freshness. You might dream of apples, pears, or cherries, but the truth is most fruit is seasonal, and in winter or early spring, it's simply gone. No refrigerated trucks, No supermarkets shipping in oranges from the other side of the world. If the trees aren't bearing, you're out of luck. When you do get fruit, it's often shriveled, preserved in honey if you're rich, or dried until leathery if you're not. That one juicy crunch of an apple plucked straight from the tree in late summer, that's a memory you hold on to for months, wishing you could taste it again. Vegetables aren't much better. Your garden gives you cabbages, leeks, onions, maybe some beans or peas. These are hardy, reliable crops, but they are repetitive. The cabbage, in particular, becomes the backbone of meals, boiled again and again until it surrenders completely, leaving behind limp leaves and a smell that clings to your clothes. It fills the stomach, yes, but it doesn't thrill the tongue. And yet, you rely on it. Without vegetables, even meager ones, you'd fall ill. You don't know the word scurvy yet, but you feel the ache in your gums in late winter, that faint bleed when you chew too hard, and you know your body misses something fresh. You watch as a neighbor pulls turnips from the earth, dirt still clinging, their pale flesh revealed as he scrubs them. They'll be diced and boiled into pottage, thickened, until everything becomes one mushy whole. Sometimes, a few herbs brighten the pot: parsley, sage, maybe a sprinkle of dill if the season is kind. Herbs are your only seasoning most days, since spices are out of reach, locked behind the coin purses of the wealthy. Nobles dust their meats with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron, turning meals into aromatic feasts. But you're lucky if you get a pinch of mustard seed or a handful of wild garlic pulled from the hedgerow. Historians still argue about just how vegetable-heavy the peasant diet was. Some insist you were mostly vegetarian by necessity, while others argue that you ate more dairy and small amounts of meat than modern people assume. But looking at your bowl now, thick cabbage stew with a few beans floating lazily, it feels pretty clear what dominates. You shovel another spoonful in, not because it's delicious, but because it's fuel. And that's what food is for you: stamina, survival, a way to keep moving through the endless grind of work. You glance toward the manor and imagine the noble table. There, vegetables are treated differently. They might be served in elaborate tarts, or glazed with honey, roasted until golden instead of boiled into gray oblivion. You picture carrots sliced delicately, sprinkled with imported sugar, their sweetness highlighted instead of drowned. Meanwhile, your carrots, when you get them, are gnarled, dirt-colored, sometimes bitter. You can't help but laugh at the idea that centuries later, people will complain about baby carrots in plastic bags, as though convenience is a burden. Still, the occasional surprise appears. Wild berries in summer bring bursts of joy, staining your fingers purple as you pop them into your mouth, one after another. Mushrooms gathered from the forest add earthy depth to a stew, though, of course, there's always the risk of picking the wrong ones. You remember the story of a family 2 villages over who ate the wrong mushrooms and never woke again. That memory tempers your enthusiasm, but still, when the safe ones appear, you're grateful. One of your neighbors, older and more daring, insists that weeds like nettles and sorrel can make fine soups in spring. You've tried it once, carefully boiling nettles until their sting was gone, and found it edible, if not inspiring. Still, it was green, it was fresh, and it was different from cabbage. Variety alone made it feel like a delicacy. And then there's the absence of what modern people might call luxury fruits. Bananas, oranges, lemons, all things you've never seen. A lemon, if it ever reached your village, would be treated like a precious jewel, sliced sparingly for its juice in some noble's kitchen. You've heard tales of them, bright yellow fruits that taste both sour and sweet. But to you, it sounds like myth. The idea of a glass of orange juice with breakfast. That would sound more magical than a dragon. Instead, you settle for apples when the season allows. You eat them fresh, core and all, or you store them carefully in a cool place, hoping they last through winter. By February, they're wrinkled, mealy, and soft, but still better than nothing. Pears, too, when they come, are savored, but never wasted. You eat around bruises, you bite through toughness, because every scrap counts. Preservation of vegetables is limited. Pickling exists, yes, but salt and vinegar are costly, so you don't pickle much beyond the occasional batch of cabbage. That becomes sauerkraut of sorts, sour and pungent, but again, it keeps. Dried peas and beans are your lifeline through winter, swelling into hearty stews that provide what fresh produce cannot. It's monotonous, but it works. At times, you imagine color on your plate. The bright red of a tomato, though here tomatoes don't exist yet in Europe. The golden glow of corn, likewise unknown. The thought makes you laugh your descendants will one day complain about tomatoes on sandwiches or corn on pizza, while you've never even seen them. Entire flavors are absent from your world, entire textures you'll never taste. You remember once seeing a pomegranate brought back by a traveling merchant, its seeds like glistening jewels. You never tasted it, but you watched as the noble family cracked it open and ate, their lips stained crimson. That image has never left you. To you, fruit is not just food, it's a glimpse into another world, one of abundance and wealth, a reminder that your own table is starkly plain. Even so, there's resilience in what you eat. You find comfort in the repetition, in the knowledge that cabbage, beans, and leeks will keep you alive. You share meals with family, passing the pot around, each spoonful drawn from the same stew, the same story repeated every day. In its way, that repetition becomes ritual. The lack of variety binds you all together. Later, as you chew on a piece of boiled onion so soft it nearly dissolves, you reflect on how future people might talk about medieval diets. Some will say peasants ate nothing but bread. Others will imagine wild feasts of roasted meats and pies. The truth, as you live it, is somewhere between plain, hearty vegetables, occasionally brightened by fruit in season, and nearly always boiled to the same unremarkable end. You sigh and scrape your bowl clean, already thinking about tomorrow's meal, which will be much the same. And yet, you survive. You endure. That cabbage stew, dull as it is gives you the strength to keep moving, to plant, to harvest, to work the endless hours. Without it, you'd fade. And so, you whisper a small thanks to the cabbage, humble though it is, for carrying you through another day. You wake to the sound of a cock crowing in the distance, a reminder that daylight is creeping across the village. The fire in the hearth has gone out during the night, and the air inside the hut is damp and chilly. You pull your rough woolen tunic tighter around yourself, shaking off the stiffness in your bones as you prepare to face another day. There is no luxury of lying in bed. Every moment wasted is work undone. And every piece of work undone means less food, less comfort, and less chance of surviving the long seasons that stretch ahead. The first task is rekindling the fire. You crouch low, using flint and steel, coaxing sparks onto a wad of dried moss and shavings. Smoke curls into your eyes, making them sting. But at last a flame catches and begins to spread. You feed it carefully with twigs, then larger sticks, until the hearth glows again with a small but steady fire. The heat is faint, yet enough to warm your hands and chase away the morning chill. Your household stirs slowly. Children rise groggily, rubbing their eyes, and your partner begins to prepare the morning meal. There isn't much, some coarse bread left from yesterday, a scrap of butter, and perhaps a ladle of thin pottage reheated from the night before. Breakfast is not a feast. It is simply fuel to get through the morning. You chew the tough bread slowly, washing it down with a sip of ale. The flavor is sour, the texture dense, but it fills your stomach enough to keep you moving. Once outside, the village begins to come alive. Smoke rises from other chimneys, and voices carry across the damp air. The rhythm of the day is the same as it was yesterday, and as it will be tomorrow. Labor, rest, and labor again. You join the others heading toward the fields, tools slung over shoulders, ready to work until your muscles ache. The earth is heavy from rain, your boots sinking into mud as you walk. In spring, the fields demand endless attention, sowing, weeding, repairing fences. In summer, there will be hay to cut and grain to tend. In autumn, there is harvest, the frantic rush to gather everything before the weather turns. And in winter, though there is less outdoor work, there are still animals to care for, tools to mend, and endless small tasks that fill the short days. The cycle never ends. It turns like the seasons themselves, a wheel you are bound to. Work in the fields is backbreaking. You bend, hoe, pull weeds, drive oxen, and sweat through layers of wool. Your hands blister, your back stiffens, but you push on. There is no choice. Without this work, there is no food. The soil is your lifeline, and though it often yields grudgingly, you return to it with stubborn devotion. At midday, there is a pause. You sit at the edge of the field, pulling from your satchel a small bundle of food, more bread, perhaps some cheese if you are lucky, and a piece of onion or leek for flavor. The meal is simple, eaten quickly, and then it's back to labor. The sun climbs and falls, shadows lengthen, and by the time you trudge home, your body feels wrung dry. The evening meal is the heart of the day. Families gather around the fire, sharing what little they have. Tonight, the pottage is thicker, beans and barley swelling in the pot, flavored with herbs from the garden. The children eat greedily, and you, though tired, find comfort in the warmth of the stew. It tastes of earth, of smoke, of survival. After the meal, there is no rush to bed. The sun has set, but work continues indoors. Wool is carded, flax spun, clothing patched. Stories are told, songs sung, children lulled to sleep by familiar rhythms. You sit by the fire, mending a tool handle, your mind wandering. The glow of the hearth is the center of your world, small and fragile against the vast darkness outside. There are dangers always. Bandits on the roads, sickness in the village, storms that flatten crops. You have little control over these forces, yet you endure them. Prayer helps, as does the tight bond of community. Neighbors rely on one another. If one family falters, others step in. Alone, no peasant can survive. Together, the village stands a chance. Sometimes you hear stories from travelers, tales of distant lands, of cities with stone walls and bustling markets, of ships crossing seas to bring back wonders you cannot imagine. These stories feel half like dreams, yet they remind you that the world is larger than your small patch of earth. Perhaps you will never see it, but you know it exists, shimmering beyond your reach. Festivals punctuate the year, rare moments of respite from toil. The village gathers for feasts, for dances, for church holidays that mark the turning of seasons. Bread is shared more freely, ale flows more generously, and for a night or two, laughter drowns out hardship. You live for those days, brief flashes of joy that break the monotony. They remind you that life, though hard, can also be sweet. But most days are not festivals. Most days are like today: labor, food, rest, and labor again. It is a life of repetition, of survival more than comfort. And yet, in that rhythm, there is a kind of steadiness. The world outside may change, kings may rise and fall, but here in the village, the cycle endures. Night falls, and you crawl into bed, straw mattress prickling, rough blanket pulled tight. Your body aches, but exhaustion pulls you quickly toward sleep. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. And so you let go, trusting that the fire will hold through the night, and that the wheel of life will carry you onward. The night stretches long, and you lie in the dark, listening to the faint creaks of the hut and the soft breathing of those around you. The fire has burned down to embers, glowing faintly in the hearth, casting tiny pools of orange across the floorboards. Beyond the walls, the countryside is silent, but for the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of wind through thatch. You are safe enough here, though safety in the medieval world is never guaranteed. A spark could set fire to the entire village. Illness could spread with terrifying speed. Soldiers on the march could demand lodging and leave ruin in their wake. Yet, in this quiet moment, all is still, and the rhythm of ordinary life hums on. You think about the food that carried you through the day. The bread, heavy and dense. The ale, sour but dependable. The pottage, endlessly reheated and stretched to cover another meal. It is not luxurious, but it is what keeps your body moving. You can almost taste the faint bitterness of yesterday's onions still lingering at the back of your throat. And tomorrow, you will wake to more of the same. It would be easy to complain, but you know you have little choice. This is survival, not a menu you get to order from. Food defines your days more than anything else. You rise to eat, you work so you can eat again. You fall asleep on a stomach that is never entirely satisfied. Sometimes, when supplies are thin, you go to bed hungry, your belly twisting as you shift on the straw. Other times, after a festival or harvest, you collapse full and heavy, a rare indulgence that leaves you smiling in your sleep. It is strange how a meal can feel like fortune or misfortune, depending entirely on its size. You remember the great feast after last year's harvest, when the villagers gathered in the square with torches blazing and a pig roasting on a spit. The smell filled the air for hours, drawing everyone near, and when the meat was finally carved, each bite tasted like wealth itself. Even if you only had 2 or 3 pieces, you savored them, chewing slowly, storing the memory as if it could be eaten again later. That's the way with peasants. Sometimes, the memory of good food has to sustain you just as much as the food itself. Yet hunger is a teacher. It sharpens your awareness of what is precious, makes you grateful for scraps, turns ordinary flavors into delicacies. A bowl of hot porridge on a winter's morning feels as luxurious as gold, even if it is just oats and water. A leek pulled fresh from the garden can taste brighter than any exotic spice, simply because it is yours. Scarcity has a way of reshaping your senses, teaching you to find joy where others would find only lack. There are stories passed around the hearth about strange dishes eaten by nobles, pastries shaped like castles, meat pies filled with songbirds that burst out when the crust is cut, golden platters stacked with sugar sculptures. You hear these tales with a mixture of awe and disbelief. You cannot imagine such waste. Food is too precious to be made into a spectacle. Still, there is part of you that wonders what sugar even tastes like. Wonders if those lords and ladies tire of their luxuries the way you tire of barley and beans. Historians still argue whether such extravagant displays happened as often as chroniclers claimed, or whether they were mostly symbolic exaggerations. But for you, they exist only in the realm of imagination. Your daily bread, in every sense, ties you to the seasons and to the land. In winter, the loaves are dark, almost bitter, made from rye or barley, sometimes stretched with ground acorns or peas when wheat is scarce. In summer, you might have lighter loaves, softer and sweeter, though still nothing like the fluffy bread modern bakers create. Each bite is work transformed into sustenance. You plowed for this bread, sowed for it, weeded for it, prayed for the rains to fall and the sun to shine. Eating it is not just a meal. It is a reminder of months of effort, distilled into a crust that cracks beneath your teeth. And yet, as important as food is, it does not entirely define you. There are other rhythms in this life, softer, but no less vital. There are the songs sung as you spin wool by the fire, the stories shared as children drift off to sleep, the whispered gossip about neighbors, and the jokes made at the expense of village animals. Even in a world where meals are plain and work is endless, laughter finds a way. Someone always manages a jest about the miller's donkey, or the priest's sermons dragging longer than necessary. Someone finds humor in the absurdity of life, like the time your neighbor swore he saw a spirit in the woods, only to realize it was a goat tangled in brambles. These small moments matter. They carry you through the monotony, like breadcrumbs scattered along a long and weary path. You may not dine like kings, but you smile like them, at least for a while. As the years turn, you become attuned to the smallest signals of change. The smell of damp earth that announces spring, the hum of bees in summer, the sharp bite of autumn air carrying the smoke of burning stubble from harvested fields, the silence of winter nights when even the animals seem to huddle closer together. Food shifts with these seasons too, sometimes generous, sometimes meager. You learn to save, to stretch, to make do. A handful of beans must last weeks. A salted piece of pork is carved so thinly that each slice is almost transparent. And yet, it feels like a feast when it graces your bowl. There are times when survival becomes a delicate balancing act. A storm can wash away a crop. A sickness can take the livestock. And suddenly, the winter looks long and empty. You tighten belts, thin soups even more, chew on bread that grows moldy faster than it should. Hunger gnaws, but you keep moving. The human body, after all, is stubborn. It clings to life even when life feels like little more than endurance. But there are rewards too. A spring morning when the first shoots of green push through the soil. A summer evening when you sit on a fence rail, ale in hand, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. An autumn feast when bread is stacked high on the table and the harvest finally feels secure. These moments do not erase hardship, but they soften it. They remind you that not everything in this life is struggle. Some things are still beautiful. The scholars of later centuries will debate endlessly about how peasants lived, whether your diet was truly as monotonous as it seemed, whether the village bonds were as strong as the records suggest, whether your world was grimmer than the chronicles described or gentler than the stereotypes allow. They will argue over numbers, dispute interpretations, build entire careers around piecing together fragments of your existence. Yet you, living it, do not think in those terms. You think only of tomorrow's bread, tomorrow's labor, tomorrow's chance for rest. History is something others write. You simply live. Now, as you feel the weight of sleep pressing on your eyelids, your breathing slows. The day has been long, the food plain but filling enough, and the warmth of bodies nearby lulls you toward dreams. You imagine, perhaps, a table heavy with strange dishes, a vision of plenty that belongs more to story than to reality. Or maybe you dream of simpler things, a fresh loaf, a fire that doesn't go out, a morning when your bones ache a little less. The night deepens. The world outside is hushed, as though the fields themselves are resting after their day of toil. The stars shine unseen above the thatch, ancient and steady, the same stars that guided your ancestors and will shine long after your life has ended. The embers in the hearth glow softer, fading into darkness, but not before casting one last flicker across the walls. You surrender to that darkness willingly, your body too heavy to resist, your mind finally quiet. And as you drift away, you carry with you the quiet truth that, though medieval food might have been the worst in history, it was also the thread that held everything together, the rhythm of hunger and satisfaction, the pulse of labor and reward, the daily struggle that wove itself into the fabric of survival. Harsh as it was still life. And in the end, life was enough. The hush grows deeper still. The story softens like a candle burning low, words stretching long and slow, your breathing steadying as the world slips into a gentler rhythm. There is no urgency now, no hunger, no ache, only the slow turning of the seasons and the comfort of knowing you have endured them. So let yourself drift. The fields will wait. The bread will rise. The sun will climb again tomorrow, as it always does. For now, it is enough to rest. It is enough to let the darkness cradle you, to feel the last warmth of the hearth against your skin, to close your eyes and surrender to the quiet hum of sleep. Rest easy, because though history may remember this food as the worst, your body remembers it simply as survival. And survival, however humble, is its own kind of triumph. The morning returns with its pale light creeping through the cracks in the shutters. And once more, you open your eyes to the familiar sight of smoke-stained beams overhead and the smell of damp straw beneath you. The fire in the hearth has gone completely cold, only faint gray ash left to whisper of last night's warmth. You shift, feeling the stiffness in your back, the ache in your knees, the heavy weight of a life built on labor. Yet you rise anyway, because there is no other option in this world. Each dawn is another call to survive. The animals stir before you do. A muffled cluck comes from the corner where a hen is tied to keep it from wandering. Outside, you can hear the soft snorts of pigs shifting in their pens, restless for food. Someone in the village has already begun to move about, their footsteps crunching on frost-crusted earth. The air is sharp with cold, but it is also clean in a way that makes your lungs burn when you breathe it in deeply. The smell of wood smoke from neighboring huts drifts faintly across the morning stillness. You gather what little strength the night has restored and step outside. The ground is hard beneath your bare feet, and you curse softly under your breath as you bend to gather a bit of kindling for the fire. Smoke curls from a few other huts, and you hear the distant call of a crow announcing the day. The sky is pale gray, and there is a sense that the sun will not fully show its face today, hiding behind clouds heavy with winter's breath. Your first thought, as always, is food. A crust of yesterday's bread sits waiting, harder now than stone, but still edible if softened in warm ale. You chew slowly, feeling it scrape against your teeth, the flavor dull, but filling enough to begin the day. The drink is sour, faintly sharp, but it settles your stomach and warms your chest. This will be enough to carry you through until midday, when perhaps a pot of pottage will bubble again over the fire, turning whatever scraps remain into something resembling a meal. The day's work stretches before you like an endless road. The fields must be checked, even in this season when growth has slowed to almost nothing. The fences must be mended where the pigs have leaned too hard. The thatch on the roof threatens to slip again after the last heavy rain, and if you do not climb up and fix it, the water will find its way inside, soaking straw beds and spoiling what little grain you have stored. Each task is ordinary, but none can be ignored, for every small failure grows into disaster if left unattended. As you work, you think again of how fragile survival is. The bread in your stomach is only there because the harvest was not entirely ruined. The roof above your head stands because you patched it with your own hands. The warmth in your chest lingers only because you spent part of yesterday gathering wood. Nothing is given freely. Everything must be earned, scraped, held onto with a tenacity that exhausts even as it sustains. And yet, you are not alone in this labor. Others in the village rise alongside you. Their voices carry on the wind greetings shouted across yards, children laughing as they chase one another through the mud, the low murmur of women already at the wells drawing water. A community like this survives only by leaning on each other, though there are arguments and grievances as well. Land boundaries spark disputes. Borrowed tools are not always returned. Gossip fuels suspicion. Still, when hardship strikes, it is often these same neighbors who come to your aid, sharing what little they have, helping mend a roof, offering a loaf when yours is gone. Midday arrives slowly, the gray sky never brightening, but the cold sharpens your hunger and drives you back toward the hut. Inside, the hearth has been coaxed to life again, and a pot of pottage simmers, filling the air with the earthy smell of beans and barley. You crouch close, stirring it slowly, watching the bubbles rise and break at the surface. The taste is always the same, but still it brings comfort. Each spoonful feels like a small victory against the hunger that gnaws so constantly at your belly. While you eat, you listen to the sounds around you, the crackle of the fire, the scrape of wooden bowls, the faint drip of water leaking somewhere in the roof. It is a simple symphony, but it belongs to you, to your life, to this place and this time. You take another bite, and though it is plain, it warms you from the inside out. The afternoon passes in its steady rhythm of work. You walk the edges of the field, your boots sinking into soft mud where frost has melted. You tighten loose bindings on the fence, drive stakes deeper into the earth, check the small store of hay for the animals. The work is endless, but it is also grounding. Each movement ties you more firmly to the land, reminds you that survival is not a matter of chance alone, but of effort repeated day after day. As the sun sinks, though it was barely visible, the cold creeps back in, sharper now, biting at your fingers and nose. You return to the hut, knowing that soon the fire must be stoked again, and the animals settled for the night. Darkness falls quickly, wrapping the village in silence broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the hoot of an owl. Inside, the hearth glows bright once more, and you gather close with the others, bodies pressed together for warmth. Stories rise in this darkness. They always do. Tales of saints and miracles, of kings and battles, of spirits wandering the woods at night. Some are warnings, others are distractions, but all serve the same purpose: to make the long evenings shorter, to make the dark less frightening. You listen, adding your own laughter or nods at the right moments, and for a little while, the worries of hunger and labor fade. When the stories end and the fire burns low, you curl again into the straw, your belly not quite full, but not entirely empty either. The night presses close, and once more you drift toward dreams. In those dreams, you see visions of abundance, fields heavy with grain, tables laden with meats, cups overflowing with sweet drink. You know these are illusions, but they comfort you nonetheless. In the dream, your body does not ache, your stomach does not twist with hunger, your hands are not cracked from labor. In the dream, you are simply at peace, and when morning comes again, though your body aches and the hunger remains, you rise still, ready to face it once more. Because that is what life demands, and that is what you give.